Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Meteorman. So, I went in and I watched this film because I was like, you know what? Like, it's been such a long time since I've watched this film. And plus, it's just kind of one of those where it kind of stuck out to me as, like, every single time I would go into a show like Black Lightning and I would see Robert Townsend, who ends up playing the Meteor Man in this movie. I'm immediately like, just like, hey, there's Meteor Man. Like, I never call him what his actual name is in the show. I immediately just call him Meteor Man because that's basically where I know him by. But I've never actually fully fledgedly sat down and watched this entire Meteor Man movie, so that's why I just decided to do so. Really, I thought that this movie was so much fun at a certain point. Kind of once we have Jeffrey Reed, who ends up getting hit with the meteor, then this movie gets so much more exciting. Then that's when the movie actually picks up, and that's when you can actually invest in this film. Really, a lot of this movie is to basically showcase what powers Meteor Man does have, then eventually go and eventually take them all away from him. Really is the journey of this story. So I thought that this show was fairly interesting, but then again, I'm also realizing how like this movie was only made to possibly just be a one-off, and how reasonably this film was uh, really just to have fun, just to be a fun adventure, but also try and come up with something really original out of a bunch of copying and pasting stuff along the ways. We end up having also Robert Townsend's character, who is eventually to go through a repetitious costume change to figure out what costume he will actually be, what persona he will actually look like, to where I think reasonably there is a lot of time with Jefferson not even in the suit. Like, I think that Jefferson probably had maybe a good whole like 10 minutes in the actual suit in this entire film, because we end up having it to where Jefferson really is just really really just not in the suit for a bulk of this film. We really have it to where he is just a civilian, and we end up having a bunch of people just attacking uh, randomly at points Jefferson. So that's why he doesn't have the actual Meteor Man suit within this film. It seems justified, but then again, I'm just kind of like, they could have done any number of things that could actually had Meteor Man in the actual suit, but didn't. Really, when watching Black Lightning and immediately seeing Robert Townsend in that show, I immediately say, oh, hey, there's Meteor Man. But while also watching this movie, I started to make a ton of comparisons between this film and actually the show Black Lightning itself. It seems that they have the same villain name. They end up having also seemingly fairly similar backgrounds. It seems that Robert Townsend is seemingly a teacher within this movie, and eventually we end up having Black Lightning, who eventually becomes a principal, but then eventually settles to eventually being a teacher. We end up having within this movie, we end up having eventually some very visually interesting characters. We end up having James Earl Jones, who ends up, of course, having to go through a different barrage of wigs throughout this entire film. We end up having Eddie Griffin, who is Michael, who is playing Meteor Man's trusty sidekick within this film, and even at some point ends up stealing his outfit to try to get women to swoon after him. We end up also having a very interesting gang for the Meteor Man to go up against. We have these Golden Lord Ash like gang members that are eventually putting the boots into a lot of part of this town, to where hence why some of the people in town are just like, well, the escalation of all this is just making us realize that, well, maybe we should try to call a truce between us and the gangs. Maybe we should try to pay them off. And we end up having Meteor Man, who's like, no, like, we have to stop this fighting. We have to prevent this. Like, if they're just gonna keep on walking over us, like, eventually we just have to get to a point where we have to, like, say this has to stop. So it's kind of like a full turnaround because we end up having at first Jefferson Reed is very much coward, but then eventually once he gets his powers, he realizes how much he can actually do for this community. But also we end up realizing how much this community is also kind of forcing a lot of things onto Meteor Man to where it seems like he is overwhelmed. It seems that Meteor Man is really just overexerting his powers, and it seems that Meteor Man eventually gets exhausted. So yeah, really, there are some interesting powers that go along within this movie, but they're also like they're interesting, but also they're fairly goofy. We end up having, of course, Meteor Man who has the ability to talk to his own dog. We end up having Meteor Man who ends up being able to even much more speed read a book than you would believe. And really, we end up having Meteor Man who has kind of all kinds of common powers, which eventually we'll get to that within the film. So, with that said, I think that's all that I have to say within this film. Like, I thought it was a fun film. I thought it was really interesting. I thought reasonably there was kind of an easy way for this movie to be written the way I thought it was going to be. Like this movie was kind of predictable in all brutal honesty, but that doesn't mean that this movie wasn't fun. That doesn't mean that this movie wasn't an adventure that I did enjoy. Um, but yeah, I thought that this movie uh, was kind of there's a lot of different things going on here, and a lot of those different things going on I could enjoy, I could handle. So let's go into spoiler times about this movie because I've kind of went into a roundabout way to talk about this movie cryptically. So spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this movie, like I said, we end up having Jeffrey Reed, who is kind of very much a cowardly teacher, and he ends up kind of telling all of his kids, all of his students, to act cowardly as well. Quickly eat their lunches, try to avoid fights, try to run away from them, and really we end up having eventually Meteor Man slowly but surely losing kids or teenagers or whoever to just gangs because it's easy because it's simple. So going along into here, we eventually have it to where Meteor Man is to basically have a father that seems to not just let things go. We end up having eventually Meteor Man who is to go is to go home to seemingly have a guy named Ernest Moses who is to put on different kind of wigs, and we end up having Meteor Man wanting to trade off uh, certain wigs and certain things and just have a little adventure here. But then we end up having eventually that Ted Reed is to eventually get into the face of one of these gang members, and it kind of gets to the point to where it seems that Don Cheadle's character is going to kill Ted Reed, but eventually this all dissolves because eventually the police end up showing up, and so Reed is kind of giving him crap, but just like, well, hey, like Ted Reed is just like, well, hey, like, come on, buddy, like, step up to me. What were you saying? Like, what were you gonna do to me now that the police is right there? And so we eventually end up having we eventually end up having Jefferson Reed eventually going on his own in the town, and eventually he ends up winding up in a place that he should not have, to where eventually we end up having this Golden Lord gang following uh, Reed bizarrely, and while they are to do that, they're consistently chanting something. I can't tell exactly what it is. Like to me, it sounded like they kept saying like either Lord or noise or something. Like I couldn't tell. Like it sounded like they were saying like noise a bunch of times, like noise, and I was like, what? It's like maybe they were saying Lord. I don't know. It was a whole like Yancey thing where it's like, what did they say? What were they saying? Um, Going into this, so we end up having Jefferson Reed, who is to eventually try and hide into a dumpster, and we end up having scouts trying to find Jefferson, and so we end up having two gang members saying like, well, hey, maybe he's in that dumpster, and they're like, no, he's too stupid to hide in that dumpster. That's the dumbest place to hide. And so we end up having a little kid who ends up opening the dumpster anyways, and of course Jefferson is hiding within it. And so we end up having the kid mentioning to the other thugs that well, there isn't anybody here, kind of just letting Jefferson live. So we end up having Jefferson, who is to eventually get out of this dumpster, to eventually have a meteor arrive and hit him to the point where he's having like severe burns and all kinds of things. So we end up having Jefferson, who is going on uh, to go to the hospital to where he is going and being taken really good care of. We end up having, of course, Jefferson, who before this had went to school, and we end up having a science teacher who is, of course, Michael, who is Eddie Griffin, and he is to basically say that, like, hey man, why do we need to make money off this school. Like, if anything, pretty soon we're gonna invent something that's just gonna be able to, uh, like, sign our checks for the rest of our lives. Because we have it to where Michael is kind of putting together like make rich schemes. So we end up having Michael, who is eventually hovering over Jefferson, hoping that eventually he's going to come back too. And we end up having Michael, who is to go and try to schmooze one of the nurses, trying to basically ask her, it's like, well, hey, like, what is my friend's condition? How about you and me go to a restaurant tonight to talk about my friend's condition? Like, how about we go out tonight so I can be consoled and we can talk about my best friend's condition? And so we end up having the nurse is like, you have got to be kidding me there, buddy. So we end up having Michael, who ends up, of course, striking out. So we end up having it to where eventually Jefferson is to wake up. Not only wake up, but have a 100% uh, recovery. We end up having it to where Jefferson is to have lost every single one of his scars and to also be in almost perfect health. And we end up having everyone scrambling in the hospital to try to figure out what had happened. How is it that this person was miraculously able to cure himself? And it seems that we also have it to where Meteorman is also having some nurse that he is immediately being won over by. So we end up having a lot of the doctors who are trying to figure out how exactly that Reed was able to be 100% how he basically how his body just cured himself. And so we end up having some doctors that are trying to figure out exactly like in their research in their head, like where exactly that this could have quite possibly been a thing to cure Reed. But we end up having Reed, who ends up bizarrely having a textbook right next to him where he ends up accidentally touching it. And we end up having Reed, who ends up going and reciting some part of this book that ends up kind of counteracting what these doctors are saying. And so we end up having Reed, who is like, well, hey, like you guys should pay attention, pay a little bit more attention to your chapters because, yeah, like I figure this out in just a minute or two or less than. But eventually, we end up having it to where Reed is to eventually lose this information after 30 seconds. So, whatever book that he ends up touching, he only gets the knowledge of whatever he is to have for only 30 seconds, I guess, to really just answer one question or reasonably just to get some information for a brief period of time. So, we end up having it to where eventually the Meteor Man is to feel much better. And so we end up eventually having the Meteor Man poking his head out the window to eventually realize that he is to see a bunch of people in pretty much their underwear. To where we end up having Reed realizing that he is actually seeing people in X-ray vision, that he does have X-ray vision, and that he can actually see people in all of their glory. So we immediately have Jefferson, who ends up calling on the nurse that he actually and likes. And so we end up having Jefferson calling this nurse over for it to be yet another nurse that Jefferson, of course, does not like. So we end up going on and we end up having uh, we end up eventually having this nurse eventually giving Jefferson his release papers and basically sending him on his way because he has full health. He's perfectly fine. So we end up having Jefferson, who is to realize with Michael all of the powers that he does have, to where we end up having Michael, who is to uh, ask him questions about a book that he has never read. And so he starts giving all this information about these centerfolds and all of these celebrities and all kinds of things that he had no previous knowledge of. So we end up going along and having eventually uh, his family is starting to realize that this guy is to have superpowers, and so they're like, well, hey, like, if he is going to eventually have superpowers, we should probably give him a super suit. Like, we end up having him finding out that it seems that he has some kind of a green laser beam coming out of his eyes. Eventually, we also end up having him showcase that he also has super strength. He also has the ability to fly, and just kind of all around all kinds of like other powers that eventually he ends up just kind of using at his disposal at some point. I think at one point he also was able to use like a wind breath, I think maybe at one point in this movie, but maybe I was wrong. Going into this, so going further into this film, so we eventually have uh, it to where Jefferson is to eventually go on to start taking down the gangs. He's starting to eventually go on to have Jefferson go up against the Golden Lords, and we end up having, of course, I think the funniest moment of this movie is when we have a character who is, God, where is he? I know he's the big guy. Digit? Tom Lister Jr. We have this character called Digit, who is this big muscle of a man, And so we end up having Digit, who ends up going and punching and hitting and whatever Meteor Man, and that just ends up actually just injuring Digit, to where we end up having in the very beginning of this, when the Golden Lord is to go after Meteor Man. Eventually, we end up having him breaking his arm, to where when Digit eventually goes and fights Meteor Man the second time, we end up having uh, like a Deadpool situation where Digit basically breaks every single limb in his body trying to fight Meteor Man, which I thought was hilarious. Because we end up having Digit who ends up breaking his arm, his other arm, and both of his legs. It's kind of funny. So we end up going on, and so we are to eventually have Reed getting mixed up with the Golden Lords, to where eventually the Golden Lords are kind of afraid that this guy is out there and he seemingly has powers, so they need to take him out. And so we end up having the Golden Lords who are to try to do a drive-by and to try to put all kinds of bullets into Jefferson, but it ends up just leaving him just kind of with all of these bullet holes in on his clothes, but he does not actually get shot. Like the bullets just kind of like bounce off of him, but we end up having all these like patterns of bullet impact within this man's entire clothes. So we eventually have at some point that there are some people trying to say that they are Meteor Man, but they are not. They do not actually have superpowers whatsoever. We end up having people that are just going on the news as quickly as possible just to see that they are the Flying Man. They are this superhero, but they actually aren't. And so we end up having Meteor Man, who is kind of afraid that the Golden Lords are going to be able to, or are going to go after certain people that are not actually the Meteor Man, and they do not actually have his powers. So we eventually go on into this movie to eventually have Michael, who is desperate to try and steal the Meteor Man's outfit to try and go to a mall and try to say that he is him. So he is to go and get a date or go and be able to get people wooing over him because he is dressed as the Meteor Man. Um, but eventually we end up having Jefferson, who ends up talking to his dog and realizing that his costume had been taken. And so we end up having Jefferson, who ends up scouting out exactly where his costume is, and he ends up finding it. And we end up having eventually there being a problem at this mall because, of course, there are some Golden Lord members that assume that of course Meteor Man, which is here, which is actually Michael. And so we end up having eventually Meteor Man springing into action to try and take down some thugs at this mall. Ba 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 ba. We end up going on, and eventually even with Meteor Man's powers, it seems that eventually, once Meteor Man is starting to slowly but surely start to lose his power. I'm going to pause here for a second. All right. So we end up going along, and eventually the Meteor Man is to eventually be confronted by a lot of the Golden Lords all at once. And so we end up having Jefferson, who is scattered around many of the people in his town. And so we end up having the Golden Lords all putting out a bunch of guns to basically either shoot Jefferson or to shoot everyone in this entire town. So we end up having the Golden Lords who are basically lighting up bullets to shoot up all of the people in this town. And so we end up having Jefferson who ends up running as quick as he possibly can to catch every single one of these bullets, to eventually then realize that his hand is all of a sudden bleeding. And so we end up having it to where both Michael and everyone in the town are starting to realize that the Meteor Man is starting to lose his power. And so, reasonably, it's going to be soon that the Meteor Man is eventually going to need to take some time off, like take a couple weeks off and be able to recharge. And so we end up having, of course, the Meteor Man going like, well, like I can't just call it a day. Like there is so much, there's so many things going on in this town that I just can't abandon this town right now. So we end up having, of course, the Meteor Man that, of course, is slowly but surely losing his powers. Eventually, he is getting very, very tired. And so we end up having the Meteor Man eventually uh, calling a sick day from work to stay at home and rest. So we eventually end up having the Golden Lords who are starting to look for the Meteor Man. And so we end up having the Golden Lords who are to basically look uh, with of where uh, that the Meteor Man actually is. We end up having a bunch of the Golden Lords asking where Jefferson is, to of course no answer. We end up eventually having the Meteor Man's dog going and dragging the Meteor Man to a place where the Meteor Man and of course his dog could be hidden at the same time under some clothes. And so we end up having the Golden Lords coming into Jefferson's apartment to eventually not find him and then give up. So we eventually have it to where the Golden Lords are kind of sick of waiting, sick of trying to do this whole cat and mouse game consistently with Meteor Man. So eventually we end up having the leader of the Golden Lords, Simon, calling the Meteor Man out, asking him and demanding him to fight him. So we end up having Jefferson decide to go out there because it's the right thing to do. Where we end up having a lot of the other society just realizing how outmatched and out muscled they are, so they're thinking about quite possibly giving up and kind of paying off the Golden Lords. To where the Meteor Man kind of refuses, and he's like, no, like, we shouldn't do that yet. We can't give up. So we end up having the Meteor Man who is to eventually uh, have some other kind of person who seems to be able to have a meteor rock. It seems that we end up having a character who is Marvin, who seems to be able to repetitiously continue to touch the meteor and to do certain kind of powers and abilities, of course talking to dogs, but we end up having him also like turning the channel while two people are griping about like, hey man, like who changed the channel, and like they're back and forth arguing about it. We end up having also Marvin who seems to have this ability to move things with his mind. So we end up eventually having Marvin who ends up going into trying to help out the Meteor Man because he feels like it's the right thing to do, and everybody else in the town is eventually starting to pitch in to try and fight the Golden Lords, because we end up having Meteor Man, even without power, trying to fight off Simon, and we end up having Jefferson who ends up going and is like having a like bloated out eye, and like he's freaking just all injured and hurt and whatever. But that doesn't stop him from trying not to fight this because he feels that he has to. So we end up starting to have a bunch of the town all starting to pitch in. We end up having James Earl Jones throwing records. We end up having some of the people that are actually in their homes, like throwing stuff out into the yard and stuff like that to hit these people, like pots and pans and so on and stuff like that. So we end up having everybody coming out of their town or coming out of their homes to come to the defense of Meteor Man, and they're all trying to do their best to fight against this Golden Lord threat. But we eventually have it to where we end up having the Golden Lords having one simple advantage, that they are able to have guns. And of course, this town does not. So we end up having seemingly that uh, the town is otherwise to be saved by seemingly this other batch of gang members who are to eventually all show up off of this car and to eventually go on to have a much more heavier amount of guns than the Golden Lords do. So the Golden Lords have to forcibly surrender. But anyways, so we end up having the Meteor Man and Simon fighting it out. And so we end up eventually having Marvin, who is to eventually drop his meteor rock out of his coffee can. And so we end up having both Meteor Man and Simon, who is of course the villain, fighting over this rock. And so we end up having both of them both getting the Meteor Man power. And so we end up having, of course, immediately the Meteor Man is to go and touch certain books. He eventually realizes that one of the books is actually a Bruce Lee book. And so we end up having, of course, Jefferson, who is to start fighting all of these Golden Lord like members with like kung fu, like he's beating the crap out of a bunch of people. And so we eventually end up having it to where, of course, Jefferson is to eventually lose that ability within 30 seconds. And of course, we end up having Michael in the background going like, man, 30 seconds? Dang, that sucks. So we end up eventually having it to where we end up having Jefferson, who is to run to get another book. And so he ends up touching the very first book he sees, thinking that it's the same book, but it's actually not. It's actually a thing about runways, about a runway model. And so we end up having Jefferson, who ends up touching this book, and we end up having Jefferson gives Simon this book, and bizarrely they end up bizarrely doing this runway off and like starting to like take off their coats, and like they're doing this like runway thing to where eventually they are kind of evenly matched, and so they end up just starting to like just slap one another like girlishly, and then eventually we end up having it to where, of course, the 30-second book runs out, and to where again Michael's like 30 seconds, thank God, because that was awful. So we eventually have it within here that we are to eventually have Meteor Man eventually take Simon down. We eventually have him eventually just strategize. We end up having also Jefferson going and tossing on the Meteor Man suit for him to be able to take these foes down. There was a really interesting moment where Jefferson first learned that he was able to fly. We end up having Jefferson, who is to go up against this these golden lords, and we end up having Jefferson who ends up going and trying to jump as high as he could, but then realizes he ends up he ends up jumping way too high, almost flying up to this this traffic light. And so we end up having, of course, Jefferson, who is now like, how do I get down? Like, do I want to get down? And so we end up having Jefferson, who ends up kind of just sliding further along towards the end of this traffic light, to eventually the traffic light ends up breaking, and Jefferson ends up falling to where I think he ends up accidentally wrecking some, or no, uh, he ends up being accused of being a peeper, because we end up having Jefferson who just accidentally just so happened to um, have his eyes revert to a window where there was a woman dressing for the morning, and we end up having the male of this couple going and wanting to fight out the Meteor Man, and we end up having eventually Jefferson just trying to get away from this guy, which I thought was really fun. So we eventually, like I said, we eventually have it to where the Meteor Man eventually is to go and take down Simon. We end up having it to where really it just comes down to a good old fashioned uh, like punch out like fight and whatever what have you, because we end up eventually having these two characters slowly but surely losing their powers. We end up having Simon, who ends up gathering all the golden lords in front of him to just cover him with bullets, to where they're like, are you serious, man? Like, we're on the same side. And Simon's like, I don't care, shoot me. And so we end up having his own men shooting him, to where he is like, man, like I'm gonna go and I'm gonna become president. Like I'm gonna control everything. So we end up having eventually Simon, who again is to seemingly been taken down, and so we end up having, of course, a Meteor Man tying up all the villains to them for them to be arrested, and so we end up having, of course, the Meteor Man, who is eventually slowly but surely losing his powers, and we eventually realize that the Meteor Man's dog has been hurt, has been injured, and so we end up having Meteor Man, who doesn't have the power and or ability to save his own dog, but we end up having Marvin, who I guess is a dog lover, who ends up going and saving this dog's life by using his last bit of his meteor power. So we end up also having the Meteor Man at some point in this movie. He is to basically use his power to be able to feed the homeless. We end up having the Meteor Man, who is to eventually put out a bunch of seeds onto a part of land, and we end up having the Meteor Man using his meteor power to accelerate the growth of these plants, to where we are ending up seeing like gigantic looking pumpkins and apples, and everybody's scrambling to get all this food. And so we end up seeing like consistently the other use of Meteor Man's power. Then again, really, I thought that this movie was just, it was really fun. Like, it was a really fun journey. Really, there are some parts of here that kind of eventually got foggy along the way, so I kind of had to really just compartmentalize, like, what all that I remembered from this film. Just because a lot of it is just, like, powers, 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 and that's about it. And plus, eventually, once Meteor Man starts losing these powers, I'm like, oh yeah, of course they're gonna go to that route, to where he has to like struggle and do the whole like Spider-Man Tobey Maguire thing, where he has to like uh, figure out a way to regain his powers back, or he has to just start to really rally people around him, even though he's a normal human being and so are they. So, because eventually I think once we get to the point of all these guns being placed onto the Golden Lords, eventually that's when eventually Jefferson is to tie up all the villains and call it a day. Yeah, so with that said, I think that's all that really happens within this movie. I kind of covered most of it, I hope. But with that said, yeah, like this movie is just kind of fun at a certain point in this movie, and then really we kind of like they focus, I think, a little too much on the whole powers thing. Like, I get they're trying to make this superhero character seem vastly different than any of the other superheroes, and they're going to showcase why he is different. Um, but yeah, I thought like this. I thought this movie was fun. I hope at some point and someday, maybe eventually they remake this and make it a lot more fun or whatever. Um, I kind of like the fact also we eventually have Riddler also being this uh, Byers, who is a mobster who kind of ends up coming in here to trying to take his try to take his control, and that's when we end up having a bunch of people coming in with guns, and we end up having uh, on the Meteor Man side, a lot of people coming in with guns. But we end up having Byers who ends up kind of popping in here and there, especially when we are to go and try to find exactly where the Meteor Man lives. We end up having Byers who is actually there witnessing if they are to find him or not. Um, we end up having Sinbad, who is also in this movie, who is to eventually try to win over some girl because I guess he's never had a girlfriend before, and we end up having him seemingly come into the screen just to leave like shortly thereafter. Um, but yeah, like there's a lot of icons within this movie. There's a lot of interesting characters in this film. But also, I think it's about that time for me to get the heck out of here because really, I think I've kind of covered almost everything. But then again, there might be some person that would say, "Oh yeah, I remember this part of the movie," and blah 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 blah. Or there might be some people that um, honestly thought that this movie was fairly goofy or fairly fun or any number of different kind of things. Some people might have a certain reaction to this movie. Go ahead and let me know in the comments below how you felt about this film, if this is the first time that you've ever seen it, and so on and so forth. I guess. Oh man, I forgot. Really, if you have not seen this film, and you went through this whole entire review and whatever, just wanted to hear what I had to say regardless, go ahead and check this movie out on a number of different apps. It is available on an app that I've been using called See Movies. You can go ahead and see it there. You could probably really realistically go into any number of movie apps and watch it there. I forgot to mention that. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.